And Sherry, thank you very much for being with us here on the 51% YouTube channel. Now, you are a former advisor to the Australian Prime Minister on status of women. How does Australia compare to other countries in the West?
Look, Australia, I think, has made a lot of progress over the last 20 years. But as you look around at a conference like this, and you look at South Africa and some of the Nordic countries, I realise that we still have a long way to go. And probably we're really now in the middle of the pack, whereas once we were considered to be probably towards the top of the pack. So more work to be done.
Certainly with the sacking of Julia Gillard, Australia certainly captured the world's attention in terms of treatment of women and women at high levels of politics.
Yeah, I think, it's obviously an image that none of us would want portrayed. And the sad thing about politics is that the nature of the game there appears to still not value the contribution women make. So that one's a hard one because it's hard to pull apart what was gender and what was actually about the battles between political parties.
But it certainly played a part, didn't it?
Oh yeah, look, there's no doubt about that. And I think the fact that she felt she had to make a speech publicly about misogyny probably says that certainly she felt, and the world looking in also felt, that perhaps her treatment was particularly harsh.
Is misogyny still a problem in Australia?
Yeah, look, I think there's a lot of very deep-seated pockets of misogyny. And surprisingly, sometimes not in the places that you would imagine, which I think is the reason it's harder to move on. You know, there are places you think, gee, that's done. And there are other places. So, for example, I'm on the board of the rugby union in Australia, and you think sport's an area where it would be really deep-seated. And in fact, my experience there has been quite different. So I think it's never where you expect it to be, and it is where you don't expect it to be, which is why it's hard work.
So what needs to be done in terms of ensuring gender balance and gender mainstreaming in Australia?
Look, I think there's, it's all the things we're talking about here at the conference. It's making sure that women have access to capital, because obviously creating your own business is one way of just clearing all the noise and getting on with it. I think a lot of the discussions on women on boards is important because that creates a top-down push in companies to require more women on executive level, and that requires more women to be brought through companies as well. So that whole issue of women on boards has got a lot of airplay in Australia, and it's one of the areas I think where the Australian Stock Exchange has put a lot of initiatives in place that are starting to change that dynamic, but that's important. And I think the third thing is, it's the subtle things. It's about language, it's about inclusion, not exclusion. It's about acknowledging the value of the contribution of women. And then finally, it's about giving women the courage to do what they want to do and to speak up rather than step back, to not wait for someone to notice how good they are, but occasionally to speak their own story, tell their own, talk about their own value. So it's not one thing, it's all of them at the same time.
But there's only one female minister in the current cabinet. What does that say about the Australian political sector, or certainly high levels of government as such?
I think it's a very poor signal, and I'm not sure governments understand well enough the symbolism of those things. There was a lot of debate at the time, and Julie Bishop actually is probably one of the higher ranking women in cabinet, but it's the fact that she's the only one. And at the time I said, that it's a terrible message to the community that you couldn't find in, all of those women sitting in the political party just elected with a huge majority, that you couldn't find more women of talent. And I just think the symbolism of that was lost, and therefore the message is very negative.
Now, in Britain, there's discussion about the third wave of feminism, that younger women now are sort of rethinking their views about feminism and using social media and so on to sort of challenge people on the way that they view women. Is that happening in Australia as well?
Yes, and I think that's very exciting. I love the fact that social media is completely irreverent. And it breaks all the rules about who you can talk to and how you talk to them, and of course that it is used by younger people to talk to each other. Although I'm on there as well, so it's not only the young, but I think also it gathers momentum in a way that was much more difficult conventionally. we had to get people physically in the same space. So it's a powerful force that I think we're only really just seeing in Australia anyway, the capacity of that for really driving social change. We've seen it in parts of the world, obviously, like Egypt and other areas where there's been celebrated use of social media. But I think on really hardcore issues like gender inequality, we're only just seeing the beginning of that. And quite frankly, bring it on.
And Sherry, thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure.